So to start with something very general, I want to say that the set of skills, which I mentioned a few times before already, that I study, which is social cognition, can be defined at very, very basic level as a several skills or even a set of skills which allows us to interact with other human beings. And basically one may say that we have many, many processes that allows us to interact with others. So basically if you are amnestic or you have some attentional problems, then you cannot interact well. So here we're gonna stick to more socially oriented processes that I'm gonna list in a minute. But to start with something very, very general, let's test your social cognition first. Does any of you believe that this is a happy toddler? Is it happy? Great, you passed. So basically that was it. So we know instantaneously that basically it's not happy. It's gonna cry in a minute, and we don't have to give it much of consideration to relate with its affective state. So basically the mechanism we use to infer this knowledge can be broadly defined as social cognition. And to do it more methodologically, social cognition can be separated into few general skills. And as it has been listed by National Institute of Mental Health in the United States, three of the most important parts of social cognition are social perception, and in general it's, do you see a walker here? Do you see a person? Great, another test, implicit testing of social cognition. This part is a neuropsychological examination, in fact. It's not a talk. So basically we can instantly distinguish between social and no-social agents, and we don't need much information. This guy is gonna stick with us for the rest of the lecture, because basically this is the methodology I used for most of my research, but it's not the only skill that we can examine. Another thing which is very important is, broadly speaking, emotion perception. So we can easily infer if someone is happy, sad, angry. We can do it only from his or her voice, face, or even from biological motion. This is biological motion, and this is the term introduced by the Swedish psychologist Johansson in 1973. And we can also present this type of point light walkers and still be able to tell whether they are happy or sad or etc. And finally, the third important skill, you may have heard of it, is theory of mind. So we cannot directly access other minds, so we use set of skills that allows us to infer others' goals, perspective, personality traits, etc., etc. So these are three very broad domains which are usually studied in social cognitive literature, and they're related to the social brain networks. My talk will be a bit more neuro-oriented because, most of my research utilizes either one of the two methodologies which have been listed by Zofia, and most of the research focuses on one of these three networks, which can be linked to the processes that I listed before. So basically we have so-called social perception network, and this little structure called posterior superior temporal sulcus is very important for social perception in general, but also you may have heard of the face area, that we have face area in our brains, and it's placed in fusiform gyrus. So these are the structures which activates almost instantly as you encounter any type of social agents. Another important network is, to be correct and not to give any controversy, action observation network, but you may have heard about mirroring network or mirror network, mirror neurons. So yeah, we can say it's a network which activates not only when we are planning to move our limbs or any part of the body, but also we watch other people performing any type of actions. And finally, we've got a number of structures which are linked to the mentalizing and theory of mind processes. Two of them, which are usually studied, are medial prefrontal cortex and temporoparietal junction. So they are more or less activated by either inferring about other mental perspective or our own mental states. And additionally, they are not shown here, but there's also a set of subcortical structures like amygdala, insula, etc., which are linked to the emotion processing, and basically these four networks can broadly be attributed and linked to the specific social cognitive processes. On the other hand, we can also broadly divide these processes, social cognitive processes, regarding to the level of controlled processing versus automatic processing. So Matt Lieberman published a nice review of the social cognitive systems and brain networks, and he said that basically some of our processes are more automatic. We don't have to do basically anything to have emotional response to some stimuli. We don't have to do anything to share some motor action with somebody. But on the other hand, if we infer other states based on the description of the situation they are into, etc., we need to use a set of intentional skills, so they are more reflective than reflexive. And these two types of processes can also be mapped into brain networks. So basically, now we know that it's not like either one or another. It's more like spectrum from automaticity to the control processing. But yes, this is also another possibility for dividing brain networks which are linked to social cognition by the level of the automaticity of the processes. So we know that most of the social cognitive skills are really linked to the widespread brain networks. And to paraphrase Zofia's speech, she tried to convince you that our default mode is bilingualism, but many researchers nowadays say that our default mode is social brain and being social in general. So I may try to convince you to this view, because basically we'll see in a minute that even if there are no social agents, we can spot some. So basically, we know that social perception is very, very specifically linked to the perception of bodies. So can you tell me, do you see any body here? Is there anything? Oh, so, okay, let's skip to emotion perception. What is his affective state? Is Kiwi happy? And finally, attribution of intentions. What are their intentions? Devious, I would say. So basically, it's not only social agents, and our brains are really, really specialized into perceiving social agents and even social intentions, even if they are known. On the other hand, as Zofia told you before, we do a lot of ERP experiments in generally field, not only in psycholinguistics, but also in social neuroscience. And there's, Archimboldo paintings. This is, he was a painter who painted these very specific paintings of objects which can be seen as a human face. So there's this very famous ERP component called N170, which is really closely linked to the face perception. And there was a study which have shown that, okay, if we watch Archimboldo's paintings this way, when they resemble a face, yeah, the amplitude of this negative deflection, which we call N170, is much higher than if we just see this set of fruits and vegetables, which is basically the painting in reverse. Another study has shown that emoticons viewed in canonical order, so starting with the eyes and then there's this face, yeah, elicit much larger N170 than this counterintuitive view. There was also some serious study, fMRI study, which tried to answer this very important question. What's happening in our brains when we mistake house for a face? Seriously. So long story short, our fusiform gyrus, fusiform face area is activated in very same manner regardless if we see a true face or we just mistake house for a face. So we've got a number of these funny studies which have shown that basically our brain is very highly tuned to perceiving social agents and processing social intentions even if there are nothing if there's nothing like that. So on the one hand, they are automatic. Social cognitive processes are highly automatic. But on the other, what his affective state? Using our automatic processes, we would say that what's his affective state? What's his emotion here?
Surprise.
Disgust. What else? Shock. If we were to tell what he's doing right now, what would you say? Roller coaster ride. He's running from police, etc. And now let's use some controlled social cognition. So, given the context, we can easily reframe our initial suspicion and say that he's probably very happy, but not in a very typical manner. Let's go back to more general topics. So, now that we know what is reflective social cognition, controlled social cognition, and what is reflexive social cognition, let's move to the area that is particularly close to my research line, which is communicative interactions processing. I study the processes which are linked to inferring whether people are interacting in our environment or whether they are acting independently. So basically, which allow us to navigate social world itself. We can examine communicative interactions processing in a number of different ways. And the most typical way, if you go for a neuropsychological assessment and take a neuropsychological assessment, you would be probably asked a number of questions regarding some story. And this is like very classic theory of mind test. Let's read an item. John prepares a dinner and accidentally pours some tomato sauce on himself. Within a moment, his sister enters the kitchen and, noticing the red liquid on John's face and a knife on the table, says, "I will bring the bandage." What has happened here? So we can ask a number of questions. We can ask about the affective state of the persons depicted by the story. What is John's sister feeling when she spots John? What is she feeling? She's probably terrified, etc., etc. We can instantly, infer this from the story. We can also refer to the cognitive aspects of the story. So basically, we can ask our patient, any other person, why does John's sister want to bring a bandage? Because we know that she misattributed his current state, etc., etc., etc. And finally, we can also check whether our subject was listening at all and ask, did John cut himself? So we usually read this type of stories and ask a number of questions, and we know that either they have been listening to us, they haven't been listening to us, but we can infer whether their cognitive theory of mind is good or bad, whether the affective theory of mind is good or bad. But this type of assessment has a number of limitations. For example, you have to keep in your mind a very verbal description and transfer it into some depiction of this story, and you've got to follow up it sequence by sequence to be able to respond to to each single question that we can ask. You can also, you need to be really focused not to miss anything. So basically, it's not that obvious. If you examine patients with psychiatric diagnosis or some neurological deficits, it's not the easy task for them to follow this type of the story. Okay, so we can move to something more ecologically valid, something closer to real life. And number of tests nowadays use the video vignettes for depicting some stories. It's basically like taken out from TV series. So there's this test called Mask, movie for assessment of social cognition, and one item goes like this. Cliff is the first one. This is the video. These are the screenshots from the video. which basically depicts the situation where Cliff is first to arrive at party. He and Sandra seem to enjoy themselves when Cliff is telling about his vacation in Sweden. Next, another guest arrives, Michael. Michael arrives and he dominates the conversation, directing his speech to Sandra alone. Finally, slightly annoyed by Michael's bragging story, Sandra looks briefly in Cliff's direction and then asks Michael, "Tell me, have you ever been to Sweden?" So now, when the vignette is over, we can ask, why is Sandra asking this? If our subject got her point, he would or she would be able to tell that she wants to integrate Cliff back into the conversation, which would be more or less correct answer. But it's not the only possibility here. She may or he may say that she's interested in Sweden, so she wants to go back to the topic. And if our person says something like that, we can say it's under mentalizing. So the mental state attribution did not occur, and basically no theory of mind processes can be observed. Another example of under mentalizing, maybe person may say, to find out if Michael was in Sweden too. Okay. On the other hand, if there's under mentalizing, there should be also over mentalizing. So basically, one may say that to be able to compare the two men, if we'll hear the answer of this type, we may say that, not exactly that. I think that you went a bit too far in your interpretation. And there's this theory that in schizophrenia, patients with positive symptoms of schizophrenia often show over-mentalizing. But there's also a problem with this methodology, at least for me. I believe that to be able to process this type of stimulus, you need to integrate a wide variety of the information. You need to listen to what they said, but you also have to take into account the gaze direction, facial expressions, body movements, hand gestures, proximity between the agents, nonverbal prosody, etc., etc. So if someone says, I don't know, maybe she's interested in Sweden, we don't know which of these specific abilities did not work. So basically, maybe someone had problems in, following up the conversation, which is not linked to the theory of mind per se. But maybe someone has problems with over-attribution of affective states. A number of different things could have happened here. So I started using very simplified version of communicative interactions depiction in my research, and I would like to present you with point light walkers, interacting or not. And now tell me, did they communicate? If I give you 5 descriptions, I think that most of you can easily tell that which one is correct. You want one more time? First one, do we agree that the first one is probably the best depiction among the 5? Yeah, so another one will be much trickier. Did they communicate? Hard to say right now. If I give you 5 answers, any idea? The correct one. I will give you a minute and maybe let's watch it one more time. The last one, yeah, that's the correct one. But it was not that easy as the previous one because they did not communicate with each other. So basically we didn't have additional clues. And the final one, this one works every single time, no matter which type of population we're currently studying. Basically, we don't see any wrong answers here. I think that we all know that A squats down and asks B to imitate him. B squats down. Any doubts here? I think that no one says that he or she has any doubts right now. So Valeria Manera, my collaborator from University of Nice at the time, came up with this test, which is called Communicative Interaction Database 5 Action Force Choice Test, SIT5, much nicer abbreviation. So we started using it to investigate whether healthy individuals, but also patients with virus diagnosis, are able to infer communication between the agents and to precisely describe and recognize precise actions. In our initial study, we found that basically no matter which nationality students are taking up these tests, we see ceiling level responses for the first item, approximately 90% of correct responses, which is very high. Bits lower for the second one, and recognition of precise actions still very high. So we started to wonder what's special about communicative interactions that even after degrading them to something that basic as biological motion, we're that apt to process them correctly. We've got a number of different studies nowadays which have also shown that, for example, if we present differential material to each of the eyes, subjects are more likely to state that they observe visual social interaction and just miss non-interacting agents. So we're pretty sure that social interactions receive priority to conscious perception. There's also this nice study which has shown that interactions between agents are stored in our memory as a single chunk, not like two different actions, one communicative gesture and then a response, but as a single unit. So we know that, you can easily remember and encode more social interactions than independent actions of agents, even if they are very simple actions. And finally, there's this phenomenon called interpersonal predictive coding. Basically, if we mask one of the agents with visual noise, and sometimes we're going to show an agent performing an action, or in a half of the trials, scrambled motion, which does not resemble human motion. And then we're going to show another agent who is either performing a communicative gesture or individual action. This guy will be detected at much higher level if he or she responds to the communicative action of other agent, because we instantly know what to expect from the other agent, so we can detect him at higher level. This can be linked to the coupling between our neural networks. One of them is social perception network, PSTS, etc., posterior regions. Another would be frontal action observation network. And we know that basically this coupling may be crucial for predictive coding in general, but also this very particular instance of predictive coding in social area. So knowing this and knowing that behaviorally we've got numerous lines of evidence suggesting that social interactions may be special, we started collecting neuroimaging data. First study which utilized point light motion to study social interactions was published in 2010. Loris and Tell has used different types of interactions, some of them emotional, some of them depicting synchronous action, and some just odd. I like this one particularly, to be frank. And in a half of the trials, individual actions of two agents were shown. I usually just tell our subjects that they are just working side by side at the gym, but they are not interacting. And what they observed was the widespread activity in both mentalizing network and mirroring network in response to communicative interactions compared to dyadic individual actions, which is quite a result given the fact that most of the research prior to this study has linked PSTS, posterior superior temporal sulcus, mostly to the basic social perception, like perception of biological motion per se. Here we have two agents in either case, but still we see much bigger activation in most of the social brain networks in response to meaningful interaction between agents compared to individual actions. So there were follow-up studies, and recently there was a paper published in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences suggesting that there's even specific region in our PSTS which responds not only to the presence of the interaction between agents, but also to the very specific nature of it. And it was differentially activating by two agents helping each other versus hindering each other's actions. Okay, but communicative interactions is a very general term. And we have seen that there are very many types of interactions, and no one has ever studied, okay, with point-like motion at least, what's happening if there are emotional. Most of the research has focused on the typical use of communicative gesture, like come here, okay, I go, stand up, I stand up, etc. But as we've seen, people may present a wide variety of social interactions, so we decided to create our own set of stimuli, presenting a really large body of actions, starting from synchronous activity, like sports and dancing, through the emotional displays, communicative actions, and both object and non-object related actions of individual agents. And using this so-called social perception and interaction database, we started investigating whether this type of interaction, typical communicative interaction based on the communicative gesture, may be differentially processed at the neural level compared to, for example, this type of interaction. Is this a neutral interaction? What's their current affective state? Positive or negative? Thankfully, everyone knows. And now? Still negative. So, as I told you before, we can infer a wide range of signals from this very basic depiction of few moving dots. Wow, social brain, I really like it. And what we found is the fact that in healthy individuals, okay, if we compare biological motion to non-biological motion, we will see typical activation of both PSTS and bilateral fusiform gyri. If we compare typical communicative interactions with individual actions, we may easily replicate previous findings suggesting that, yeah, PSTS, but also anterior temporal pole and a wide range of different structures is differentially activated. But if we compare specific types of interactions with each other, we may find, for example, much greater activation of medial prefrontal cortices or amygdala for emotional versus non-emotional interactions. Moreover, the reverse contrast, typical communicative interactions versus emotional displays, also elicited some specific activity within action observation network. So at this moment, we are quite sure that interactions, meaningful interactions, even degraded to this minimalistic point-like displays, elicit a wide variety of different responses which cannot be seen if we just process single individuals. Now, linking this knowledge to schizophrenia, as I told you before, we were focusing on healthy controls so far. Why should we study schizophrenia and social cognition in schizophrenia? Because it's fascinating, to say at least, but there's also a number of functional outcomes which can be improved by having a good model of social brain in patients with schizophrenia. I hope that we don't need to explain what schizophrenia is to much extent. Let's stick to the very basic definition that it's idiopathic neuropsychiatric disorder. The most important part is idiopathic, so we don't know what does cause it at this moment. And we observe both positive symptoms, hallucinations and delusions, and negative symptoms, so reduction in number of processes which can be seen in healthy controls in patients. And what is really important nowadays, it is estimated that schizophrenia is third leading cause of permanent disability in young adults. So it's also importance of societal, sorry for that, issue to know how to help patients. And why would we expect that social cognition may be important? Because basically introduction of antipsychotics allowed us to reduce significantly positive symptoms. And the main problems for most patients with schizophrenia nowadays is linked to the fact that they are not able to cope with demands of social world. We've got also a number of studies which have shown that basically each of the main domains of social cognition is largely affected by schizophrenia, and we observe at least one standard deviation difference between healthy controls and individuals with schizophrenia in each of these domains. And what is even more important, non-social cognition like memory, attention, working memory, executive function translates into everyday functioning to less extent than social cognitive deficits. I don't know, it's probably not visible there, but you may believe me that the correlation is much lower for non-social cognition with functional outcome than for social cognition. So we also know that there's a wide range of processes which can be linked to the neural correlates, and we see the deficits not only at the behavioral level, because we know that patients have problems with attribution of emotions, intentions, even in processing biological motion itself. But we also see reduced activation, task-related activation in key nodes of social brains in patients. On the other hand, there's a number of regions which hasn't been studied to enough extent to have any final verdict about them yet, and we started to see it as a more of a dichotomy between reflexive and reflective processes. And basically, as summed up by Green, we are pretty sure that if patients are told to explicitly infer someone's emotions, intentions, they will show some deficits. But for the most of the reflexive processes, we will see probably no differences or some mild differences, mild deficits in patients, because I did some studies myself using ERPs, and we found no differences in terms of, for example, affective response to affective stimuli in patients. So summing up, we know that reflective processes are probably affected. Reflexive, maybe yes, maybe no. Translating this into communicative interaction processing. At the very beginning, we started to utilize SEED5 to study whether patients will be able to recognize communication versus individual actions. Not surprisingly, we found deficits, both for recognition of communication versus individual actions and attribution of specific actions there. But if we started studying separately items presenting social interactions and those with no interactions, we found that mostly individual actions were misprocessed. So in our first hunch, we're like, oh, over-mentalizing. Maybe they see interaction when there's none. So we were, in our first paper from this line of research, we suggested that basically maybe patients have the tendency to over-mentalize what's happening between agents, and maybe this is the main reason why they misclassify individual actions. Then we found similar pattern of results in patients with temporal lobe epilepsy, and there's no strong rationale to believe that we should see over-mentalizing in epileptic patients. So we started to dig into this reflexive, interpersonal predictive coding versus explicit recognition more than over-mentalizing here. We utilized the very same methodology to investigate neuroimaging findings and neural patterns of activation to communicative and individual actions. And we basically replicated results from the initial study for healthy controls. The results were even more robust because we had a larger sample. But then we also investigated whether this nice pattern of mirroring and mentalizing networks involvement will also be observed in patients. To some extent, yes, I can say that. This is the patient's group. This is controls group. So we have seen activation in similar nodes, but to say it very mildly, it was less extent. When we directly contrasted both groups, we found that patients underactivated their PSTS node. And we were not surprised by this finding, because as I told you before, PSTS may be a crucial node integrating both very basic social perception and higher order social perception. On the other hand, we have found no direct reduction in action observation network. So we followed up this result with behavioral study, which investigated not only explicit recognition of actions, but also interpersonal predictive coding. And surprisingly, we found that yes, patients were less successful in recognizing specific items or recognizing communication versus individual actions. Yes, they had lowered visual thresholds for biological motion, but nevertheless, still they were able to use the gesture of one person to infer the potential response of another agent. And even being overall worse in performing this task, still we observe the benefit which is linked to interpersonal predictive coding. To sum up, I would say that as far as we investigated it yet, we can say that these results are in line with general mechanisms, suggesting that, okay, if we ask patients directly to explicitly tell us whether there's interaction, what's the precise nature of this interaction, we will observe deficits, which can be linked to the lowered activation, reduced activation of PSTS probably. But there are still some reflexive mechanisms which are intact, probably intact. And what is even more interesting is that basically high-functioning individuals with autism showed the exact direct opposite pattern of findings. They can, after some trainings, tell us whether this is the study where Leonard Schilbach's group, I think, from München, and they found that basically patients with high-functioning individuals with autism were able to, did not differ from healthy individuals in terms of explicit recognition, but there was zero benefit from communicative gestures in implicit task. So now we started follow-up project using the more complex methodology than the initial neuroimaging study to investigate whether PSTS may be the crucial node which deficient activity makes it problematic to integrate various types of interaction in patients with schizophrenia. And currently we're building the model using the methodology with this emotional versus non-emotional walkers. And in the second stage of the project, we'll try to validate it by stimulating PSTS with transcranial current stimulation to observe whether we can impact it. Not only observe it, not only explain it, but maybe do something with it. So, at this very moment, I would like to acknowledge some funders, and says that it wouldn't be possible to do any of this research without a wide range of collaborators from Poland and from across the Europe and States, and without my team, which is shown here, and say thank you.